And Dr. Estrada is Director of Nutrition at Carthage, where he oversees feeding programs for both the Carthage system and independent pork producers, as well as the research efforts through Carthage Innovation Swine Solutions. Jorge is originally from Colombia. He earned his bachelor's degree from Zamorano University in Honduras and later completed his master's and PhD degree in swine nutrition at the University of Illinois. His career includes extensive work across Latin America and in feed additive technical services and applied nutrition research in collaboration with major U.S. integrators. Welcome, Jorge. Thank you for doing this. ¿Prefieres hablar desde acá o moverte?
Sí, está bien.
Entonces ahí tienes el pointer, si quieres point. ¿Listo?
Muy bien. Bueno, buenos días. Thank you for the introduction. Dr. Pedro, you know, he was talking to me in Spanish here, so, you know, I got lost there for a minute. So this is probably the last month of the year that a Colombian will come here to Minnesota, at least me. You know, I had a friend here in Minnesota that, you know, from Colombia, so I asked, hey, you know, how was your first winter up there? And he was like, man, it was miserable. I'm going to be honest with you. So, well, you know, I mean, he was here, you know, 4 years, and hey, how was your second winter? He was like, he wasn't any better. He was worse. So for you guys that live here in Minnesota, you know, I mean, it's awesome, and you guys are very brave. For the people that live in Canada, I think, you know, you guys are probably, I don't know, crazy, likely. So anyway, so thanks for the invitation. I'm going to talk a little bit about something that we're very passionate about. I mean, usually, you know, this Leman conference is pretty much towards production and health. So when you get a nutritionist talking here, you know, it's hard to keep people awake. So I'll do my best. So figure, you know, we're going to start harvest. I mean, probably Illinois is probably 30% done by now with corn. I just wanted to bring up this beautiful picture. This is some corn that we got last year in one of the bins in one of the feed mills in Michigan. Michigan is pretty cold, right? I mean, not as cold as Minnesota, but still pretty cold. That's the kind of thing you see out there, guys. And a lot of times when we try to scratch our head, like, hey, what's going on with the intake of the animal, and we don't really, sometimes we don't know, right? I mean, a lot of these things, I'm going to be honest with you, you know, with this corn, when I saw this, and, you know, of course, we shared that with the, 100 veterinarians that we have in the company, those guys were like, oh, that's why, you know, a lot of mycotoxins, you know, everything was terrible. We analyzed that corn for 30 different mycotoxins. It was fairly clean. So mycotoxins wasn't the problem in this corn. Actually, this corn looked like it got very hot, and then all of a sudden it burned up, right? That's what happened with this corn. So no mycotoxins, at least the ones that we could analyze. There are more than 30 mycotoxins in the world, so who knows? Interestingly enough, like the rest of the things were more or less similar to what they should be. Starch, a lot of it was gone, right? So anyways, I just kind of wanted, you know, if we're going to talk about feed intake, might as well talk about something that, you know, coming up during the winter time and summer, it'll be important to understand. Remember that, you know, when we go through the harvest time, we try to get that corn as cold as possible in order to, you know, keep it in good condition for the rest of the year. Alrighty, well, always when we think about lactation, feed intake, and feed intake for sows in general, always this topic comes up, and you know, it's mortality. And this is something that we try to do every year to understand what's going on with the mortality of the sows. And over here, you know, probably have 200,000 sows represented in this subsample of sows. Specifically, these herds are stable or PERS negative, so we don't have any crazy things going here. But interestingly enough, compared to other years, usually, you know, winter, springtime, we got like lower mortalities, and then it picks up during the summertime. So Again, one of the things, and this is important for what we're going to talk today, is lameness, structure of the sow, sound of the sow keeps being the biggest challenge, at least in the U.S., when we talk about sow mortality, right? So that's one thing. Of course, unknown causes. A lot of those things happen, and who knows what's going on with the animals. So that will be number 2. And then prolapses, of course, is number 3. Interestingly enough, I don't know, a lot of you guys might not be very familiar with, how this mortality goes, but as you can see, usually prolapses are very heavy during so when we start the winter, so during fall and the peak of the winter time, and then during the summer, we get a little less incidence of prolapses. What happens with the sows that we breed during the summertime? They have lower feed intake, and who knows what else is going on there that, for the subsequent parity, they are always more challenged. And lastly, I wanted to point out that, heat stress. Heat stress is a real thing, right? I mean, a lot of sows, they die during the summertime because it's just too hot for them to stay in that environment. So, all right. Next step on this is, of course, we know this. Everybody knows, like, okay, summertime, those sows that I breed during the summertime, they will have less total born in the next litter. So, yeah, that's not new. Of course, as we go over the years, total born, they keep going up. Doesn't mean that the quality of the total born is better, but, they keep going up. They keep going up. So, interestingly enough, as you guys are aware, right? I mean, gilts, right? So, I mean, it's the first time they are farrowing, so it doesn't really matter. But those P1s that are becoming a P2 now, right? As you can see, compared to the mature sows, that effect is even worse, right? I mean, there is a drop in total born for those sows that were bred during the summertime or during, heat stress conditions. But definitely look at that. I mean, look at multiple sows and look at that P1, right? Again, here is much deeper. Look during 2023, much deeper in P1s compared to multiple sow. This is very important because at the end of the day, that amount of variation that we have with sows in a farrowing room, we gotta somehow understand how to manage that, not just from the production standpoint, but also from the nutritional standpoint. So feed intake, right? I mean, a lot of people, a few years ago, the Hyatt Frovas, from Gestal, he invited us to a summit, and we went there, and he was talking about this. He said, hey, we have a lot of data, and we have been able to characterize or redefine, what are the patterns of how the sows eat during the lactation period, right? So, and then there are 6 different patterns that have been identified, right? So that have been identified. This is not us. I'm just gonna describe them. That way, I'll show you a little bit of what we did with a lot of data that we collect. I mean, we're fortunate enough that we have a lot of individual intake data, and also we have all the individual performance of those sows, and that's what I'm gonna show here next. So there were 6 different ways, for those sows to be characterized. One of them is the rapid. And the rapid, what it means is, those sows basically peak the feed consumption by day 10 of lactation, right? So that's that orange line there. So those sows just start eating very well, and they just eat, and the peak of intake, it goes very fast, right? So the gradual is probably what we call a regular or the number or the normal, feed intake of the sow. Of course, she started eating well, and then after day 10, they will at some point get that peak of intake during lactation. And then the other one is what they define like as low, low, low. Those are sows that basically don't eat well throughout the lactation period. They just don't eat well, and then at least for the data set, this graph that you guys see here, this is real data. So that's what we got out of, I think it's over 4,000 sows that we have in this data set. So as you can see, those sows basically throughout the lactation, they didn't eat well. And then they also characterize something that they call the low, high, high. So those sows, they start very low, but after day 10, they actually kind of went up quite a bit. But as you can see, those sows that were characterized within that curve, they never reached the same kind of level that we saw in the other two partners. Also, they mentioned there are two things that happen as well, and they call that when there is a minor or a major drop in intake at some point during lactation. This graph here is just to make an example of how it will look like, but it could happen throughout the lactation at any given point, right? So what it means is, those sows that are have a major drop, it's those sows that are basically for 2 or more days, they actually drop the intake about 1.8 kilograms or 4 pounds, right, compared to the previous peak. And the minor was is a drop, but is below 4 pounds, right? So when we put this data together and try to understand what happened with those sows, with those different intakes and those different patterns, this is what we found. So I'm gonna try, this is a very busy table. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time here, but I just wanna show you that, okay, you got the low, 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 high, high, and then the gradual. Think about the gradual as your control, right? That's kind of how you expect a sow to eat, right? And then you got the ones that have like a minor drop, a major drop, and then you have those sows that they just eat very well, right? And very, so as you can see, the number of sows in each category, as you can see, those in the low, 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 and low, high, high, it's a fairly small number of animals, right? Fairly small number of animals. And also the other thing to point out, if you look at the average of the parity, it's just the young sows for the most part. Of course, there might be a couple of sows there that are mature, but really this is more related with the age of the animal versus how they eat, right? I guess that's, and then of course, as I mentioned before, the intake never goes as high as the rest of the herd, right? So that's very important. And then, of course, what's the impact of that? As you can see, wing weights, if they eat low, they are gonna have low wing weights, right? Pre-wean mortality, look at that. That's easily 2, 3, 4 points higher pre-wean mortality compared to the sows that are eating well. And that's not unexpected. We know that. Who knows? Those sows might be sick, right? For all we know. And then, of course, subsequent turtle bone. So the takeaway message of this is like those intake patterns, they really doesn't explain, they don't explain the performance of the sow, other than those young sows that basically, they have very low intake compared to the rest of the herd. So the question, when we were analyzing this data is like, okay, what percentage of that population is within of what we expect to be a regular sow, right? What's the numbers, the normal sow? And then, of course, our production team says, okay, I want to have a turtle born of, 16 and a half, 17, and then I want live born of 15 or something else, and, I want to, win a total of 13 pigs, right? That sow, that specific description only matches 6.7% of the population. The rest of the animals are something else, right? So, and that's the challenge, right? That's what we gotta think. Juan Carlos was thinking, what kind of technologies do we need to use in the future in order to, have a better reproduction? Well, similarly, part of this is, how we manage, how we feed those sows that have such a big difference in, in characteristics, right? So, before I get into the next few slides, I just wanted to, we know this, right? Of course, younger sows compared to P2s, compared to multiparous sows, they eat less. Yeah, we know that. How much less, right? What's the difference, right? And again, I'm gonna say this, and this is a number that we try to use quite a bit in our system and with the people that we work with, and is understanding how many, how much is the difference between a P1 compared to the herd. In a general sense, a P1 compared to the average of the herd is eating about 20% less lactation feed compared to the herd. This is very important because understanding the average consumption of the sow unit, that's fairly easy. The thing is understanding, the younger sows, that are in that sow unit was the intake of those. So I'm gonna set up this slide here. We're gonna discuss a couple of things that I wanted to bring up to you today. We split that herd in three, right? Or this data set. So you got P1s, P2s, and multiparous sows, right? And then we define the sows that are in the lowest 25 percentile, the average sow, which is 50% of the population, and the sows that are eating, the highest, right, the other 25% of the population. So those are the three bars that you see here. So for young sows or for P1s, that means that those sows are in average eating around 13 pounds of feed a day, right? That's actually, for a gill, that's a pretty decent feed consumption. And especially the data that we're pulling this information from, those sow units, actually they have very good consumption. We have sow units that actually have, in average, maybe have 13, 14 pounds a day, right? This sow unit in average, or this data set, as you can see, in average the whole herd is about 16 pounds or so. And then therefore, of course, 25% of the population of those younger sows are below 10 pounds. That's a very, very low feed intake, and then so on and so on for each of the categories. So that means that, of course, at the end of the day, feed intake doesn't mean anything if you don't understand what the sow is actually getting. And then in this case, of course, if we have the detailed data, we can understand that. So lysine. Lysine, that's one of the nutrients, but drives a lot of the rest of the nutrients in the diet. So 56 grams here, 68, 75 grams there, right? What is the requirement of a sow? It depends, right? It totally depends, what's the wean age, what's the wean weight, how many pigs is she weaning, etc., etc. So that number there, it really is meaningless unless you understand how those sows are performing, what kind of challenges they have, etc., right? So, okay, that's that. So, digging a little bit into this, right? If you look at it, if you look at the herd, you could say, hey, 67 grams a day. It's pretty much, the guideline for the genetic company that is helping me with, to understand how I need to feed my sows. However, 19% of the herd is below that, right? So can we do anything to fix that, right? How can we manage 20% of the herd? And then 20% of the herd, most of them are the future of the herd, right? That's the other challenge, because at the end of the day, we discard so many P1 sows, right? And a lot of times it's because we don't really know how to manage them, right? So it's quite challenging. So this next graph is about the same thing. It's just, I apologize, this one is in kilograms versus pounds compared to the previous one, but here is just showing, what's the difference in weights, versus the average sow within that category. And then basically you are dropping half of a kilogram, right? So 1 full pound of weight for those sows that are eating less, but then the mortality increases 3%, right? That's another, depending on, how many pigs you got, but that's probably another half of a pig, right? So just because those sows are eating, as well. But again, the interesting thing is okay, the sows that are average, that's great. But then even the sows that eat very well, the highest intakes, yeah, that mortality is lower, right? It's even lower, pre-wean mortality. And then what's the effect of that when we discuss or when we look at the numbers for subsequent reproduction, right? Subsequent reproduction. What's the impact? In average, if you look at the average of the sow, we're basically losing, 0.6 of a pig, right? Total born for the next period. Interestingly enough, those sows that ate in the average category versus the ones that are eating higher level, there is no difference in subsequent total born. So the problem really is the ones that are eating very, low. So what technology do we have out there that could help us to identify those sows better, or what do we do to do from our nutrition program standpoint to help those sows better, right? One last thing that I want to discuss on the lactation intake before I move into kind of the practical implications of how we use this data is understanding what's the impact of, each of those kind of, if we think about, 21 days lactation, which is very common here in the US, I mean, there are a lot of systems out there trying to get to the 23, 24 days. A lot of people say, well, total born, for example, is defined, or there is a correlation between the intake of that sow during the first week and then total born, or something like that. So we looked into that, and then what we found really, I mean, the only kind of strong correlation was the weight of the pigs during the last week of lactation. So the lactation intake is very important if you want to reach higher wing weights. And this is critical. I have seen a lot of feed systems that cannot keep up with the lactation intake of the last week. But since the pigs are healthy and they are alive, nobody really cares. But if you really care about, wing weights, this is very important. And then wing weight is, of course, as we all know, is critical for the survivability of those pigs in the wing to finish sites. So therefore, we gotta do as much as we can to push that intake of that sow. I wanted to show the example of the total born, right? I mean, it really, there is no correlation between the intake of a sow at any given point with total born. Alrighty, well, that's all good. A lot of those things we can do not much about it. So, but I wanted to show you, of course, with the data that we are generating and, how we look at these and what are the next steps that are helping us to make decisions, to adjust the nutrition program, to adjust the financial program, et cetera, et cetera. So, in swine, and probably a lot of you might know this answer, but in swine nutrition, of course, since I'm a nutritionist, I gotta say, I gotta gain my own salary, right? So I say, of course, the greatest cost in production is feed, and then that's around 60 to 65% of the cost of production, right? What is that cost in sows? A lot of people don't even know. It's still the number one cost, but it's not the same. It's usually when you talk about variable costs, that's around 28, 29% of the cost of the operation. The next one in line will be labor, right? But that's important to keep in mind because, again, if feed is still the number one, we gotta see how we can be more efficient of feeding those sows and still helping the ones that are not having a very good feed intake. So this is a metric that we're trying to work a lot with, and then what I did here, there are different farms here. All of them, the farms that I selected for this analysis, for the next couple of graphs, they are gonna be in the same order. That way you can visually see what are the changes of them, right? These are different sow units that we, either we manage or we do the nutrition for, or we, So how this graph is set up is down here you have what's the rank of the PSY of that specific sow unit, right? So you got, in this case, I put like somewhere, between over 31 PSY, right? Then you got 30 PSY, 29, 28, 27, and we had some sow units there that were still healthy sow units with, 25 PSY, right? The other thing here is, how many pounds per wean pig, right? And this is gestation and lactation feed. And this is quite important because, as we discussed earlier, we talked about soundness, we talk about, lameness issues, et cetera, et cetera. And this that's gonna be my point here in a minute. As you can see, in average, 82 pounds for this And the other thing that I did for this specific subsample of cyanids, I only select the ones that have mash feed, right? Mash feed. So that way there is a little bit better understanding on that. Look at that, even within category, and let's see at the 30 PSY, which is a very decent number nowadays, at least in the US, with all the challenges that we have with different diseases. We got some cyanids with, 79 pounds. In the same category, you got cyanids at 92 pounds, right? So that's 12 pounds per pig. That's easily, $1. And then if you're winning 6,000, pigs a week, that'll be $6,000 just in one single week because of the difference in that. There could be a lot of reasons for, differences in intake and, how much feed I am using. One of them is, of course, the facilities, right? I mean, there are some designs that are better, for example, in gestation, you don't have a lot of wastage, or similarly in lactation as well, right? But one thing that, if we're not careful, a lot of these sows that we're feeding too much, a lot of them are just getting huge. They barely can fit in the crates, right? So that's one of the issues with this, and that's how we are using this data to help us to identify what are the opportunities, looking at, at the big picture, and what are the opportunities to help those sow units, to get better, to be more efficient, right? So, and then what's the correlation with that, with the lameness and stuff like that. Those are the next steps that we want to work with, and of course, we're trying to get to that point. The other thing, this is a way to express like feed conversion, total feed conversion for the sow unit, right? In a general sense. Here, we're missing one piece that we also are working with is the weight of the animals, and I didn't bring those data, but that's part of that exercise to actually, but this, in lactation feed conversion, this is with actual weights of the pigs at weaning, right? As you can see, the graph changes quite a bit now, right? It just doesn't have the same order because this is only lactation. But again, in lactation, as you can see, I mean, we got sow units that are very efficient. I mean, 2.3, 2.60. I mean, that's better than win to finish, right? I mean, so, but you got sow units, almost at 4, right? So, I mean, why? Maybe because they are not producing enough, or they are wasting a lot of feed, or they have their own nutrition. There could be different causes there. But, this is around 3 is what we see for lactation feed conversion, again, with mash diets. Lastly, I guess the other thing that I wanted to point here, and this is probably almost my last slide, is when you think about that lactation lysine intake that we discussed earlier, right? And if you look at the farms, some of the very high productive farms, they are down to 64 grams a day, right? We still gotta check, for example, what is the replacement rate of those sows? Are they being able to keep those sows alive, right? I mean, because for them being efficient, it doesn't mean that maybe they are having other reproductive issues that we're not seeing here, right? So the average in this case is 77 grams per sow per day for the ones that we have detailed information on the nutrition program. In a general sense, that means that from my point of view, 37% of the cyanids, they have an excessive intake of lysine. Why is it excessive? There might be a waste, or they're not producing enough pigs, or the pigs are too light, or there could be different reasons. But that's the data that we can actually use to put a plan in place, to improve the nutrition of the sows. So if these sows, are getting 77 grams, how much the gilts are getting? What do we say at the beginning, 80% or 20% less, right? So 80% of that is what, I don't know, 61 grams? Is that enough? That enough for a gilt? A gilt, nowadays, we see a lot of gilts with 16, 17 total bone. I'm almost sure that's not gonna be enough to keep up the lactation of a gilt like that. Especially we wanna keep her in the herd, right? So, that enough? Unlikely. It depends, right? What's your wing weight, etc., etc. So some final thoughts is, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, feed pattern intakes are helpful in the sense that that way we can set up feed curves for our sows, and if we gotta, we don't want to restrict them, but if we want to understand how they are eating, that's probably helpful. But if we want to understand the performance of the sow, that's not the information that is helping us to get there. Secondly, as I just mentioned, P1 sows are 20% lower feed intake compared to the herd, so keep that in mind. And forget about the average sow. There is no such a thing. So you gotta put together your program for that, right? The next one is low feed intake, 0.5 pigs per liter minus, 1 less pound, and then in the subsequent cycle is 0.6 pigs, right? And then there is wide variation in the efficiency of the sow units, right? So what can we do from the nutrition standpoint to work with that? Do we need to have 2 lactation diets? Likely, right? I mean, if we can, it'll be good to understand what's the intake of my sow unit and what kind of diet I need to send to that sow unit. Alrighty, thank you very much.